Hi, my name is Vesa Juvonen and I work as a principal consultant in Microsoft Corporation. In this module, we'll cover the list enhancements and customization options. There's a lot of new capabilities for these sections in SharePoint 2010. We'll start by covering the improved support for events and what are the new possibilities. Then we'll concentrate on the updates concerning the list relationships and joins. There's also nice new capabilities concerning the field and list item validations, which developers can utilize in their customizations. SharePoint 2010 has also improved support for large lists. In this section, we'll also concentrate on proper way of accessing the large list information. As a final topic, we'll concentrate on changes related to the UI rendering. We'll first cover the XSLT-based view and then InfoPath usage in SharePoint 2010. This is also an interesting topic since we can easily change the list rendering to use InfoPath forms instead of the out-of-the-box form template formats and modify the user experience that way. So in this section, we'll have a closer look on the new capabilities of the events. There are new events available in SharePoint 2010 based on the customer demand. These events are related to the life cycle of lists and web. New events follows the same model as previous versions by providing options to execute code either synchronously or asynchronously. Web events are available when we create subsites or site collections. There's also new registration capabilities to associate events to a specific lists or specific sites within site collection. In previous version, so-called after events were exclusively asynchronous, which exposed a challenge to execute code just after the item was submitted, but before displayed to the end user. SharePoint 2010 adds a new property for receiver definition to change these so-called after events asynchronous. This allows developer to do little post-processing after committing the action, but just before information is presented to user. This can be configured either in the object model or from the event receiver registration XML level. Previous SharePoint version provided a capability to cancel synchronous events and returning an error message for the end users. Since we could not modify the error page branding shown for the end users, this wasn't that flexible. SharePoint 2010 allows developers to point a custom error page rather than leveraging the existing WSS 3.0 based _layouts page with an error message. This enables more user-friendly error messages. This is achieved by canceling the user action with a redirection URL. Office Client supports also cancellation, but not the redirection to a custom error page. In WSS 3.0, when a workflow triggered an event by adding or changing something in a task list, the task item's identity would be the system account that executed the workflow. This was not that usable information for the developers. In SharePoint 2010, same is still true, but the SB Event Properties base class now contains properties that contains the username and a user token of the person who actually triggered the effective action. This information can be used in a code to generate proper information for the lists. Visual Studio 2010 provides a new wizard for creating events easily. When we start the development, we can select project type to be an event receiver, which will automatically trigger required designers. We can create the required XML elements using the event receiver customization wizard and concentrate on developing the required code for event receiver. Notice also that the same wizards are available if you add a new SharePoint project item typed as a receiver to your project, meaning that you don't have to start by selecting a project type to be an event receiver. Notice also that the wizard is providing capabilities to create web events or site events and a list workflow events using the same designer. Let's have a closer look on how the events are developed and how we can use a custom error page to provide customized error message experience when user actions has been cancelled.
So in this demo we'll concentrate on the improved event handling capabilities of SharePoint 2010, and the demo is based on the fact that we're cancelling list item creation based on some values we are entering to the list, and we're showing a custom error page for the end user to tell what actually is happening. Let's have a look on the functionality first. So when we add a new announcement, in this case we have associated the event to announcement list, we are checking the values of the items or fields which the end user is entering. So announcement, and in our case this is a demo, so we have a checker which is checking that if we have throw error in a title, we won't be saving the new item to the list itself. And let's add some body for the actual announcement list as well. So now that since we do have a invalid value which we are cancelling, we will be showing a custom error page. In 2007 we always showed an error page which we couldn't easily customize, so it wasn't that user friendly, and it didn't kind of follow up the branding of the site. Now since we are taking advantage of the dialog framework, we are actually seeing the custom error page shown in the dialog, and in this case we cancelled the item adding event or item added process or adding process, and then we showed this alternative error page which we have created as part of our customizations. Added an image, added a text, and so on. You could do whatever you want within this page, obviously. Or you might want to ask some additional information and move forward, or whatever you actually want to do. So now that we close this one, obviously the new announcement haven't been created to the list itself. So how did we actually accomplish this? In Visual Studio we have created a Visual Studio project where we have the event receiver and we have a custom error page which we are showing. Let's first have a look on how the events receiver was actually created. So if we are adding new event receivers to SharePoint, we have really nice designers available as part of the Visual Studio tools for SharePoint. So we're able to use these designers to set us the initial values of the required XMLs, so we don't necessarily have to know the details of the XMLs themselves. We're able to create different kind of events, list events, for example when field has been added or list has been added or deleted. Obviously list item event, so when the list is being added or it has been added, and so on. If we want to cancel the user's action, we need to do that in when the item is being added, so that the item itself haven't been stored or saved to the database. And we also did have possibility to create web events, for example for when site is provisioned or when site is being moved, and so on. So these are also possibilities for your customizations. Since we already have the event receiver in place, let's have a look what the designer is actually creating for us. So based on the settings of the designer, this XML file will be created. And we don't have to know the details necessarily how the XML file actually consists, but in this case the list template ID 104 actually refers to the list template ID of announcement list, and that's 104. We have a receiver. We are associating that to event item adding, and SharePoint Visual Studio tools make, for example, the assembly references for us automatically, and it creates the class for us automatically and associates that to the proper place based on our settings. The sequence numbers is there if there's multiple item adding events available or raised, then we can adjust the sequence number and decide which of our event receivers will be executed first. For the actual code itself, how do we actually cancel the item? It's done in only within the few lines of code, so really simple thing. We are checking the properties from the properties to after properties, and after properties refer to item values which the end user has been updated, or the end user has entered to the new list form. And we are checking from the title that does it actually contain throw error message. Obviously this is a demo, but we could, for example, check that the times within the timesheets are in a proper place. We won't be able to create new projects to a project list if the project end time is in past, or whatever we want. To create this a kind of additional simple business logic which is guiding the customer or end users of the portal. And since in our case the throw error was written, we set the properties of status to SP event receiver cancel with a redirect URL, which gives us the capability to redirect the end user to the custom error page, or actually to show the custom error page using the dialog framework. The custom error page itself has been implemented as an application page and placed underneath the underscore layouts folder. And in here we basically have one image, which was the error image, and we have the actual text telling for the end user that you shouldn't have this kind of a title for announcement. Let's have one more look and one more time the whole cycle. So if we're trying to add an announcement and the announcement title contains throw error message, we won't be saved, and our custom error dialog, our custom error page will be shown as in dialog mode for us. And this way we can guide the end users to do proper actions based on the items. Really good improvement compared to 2007, and helps to create consistent look and feel and user experience.
In this section, we'll concentrate on new capabilities in the list. These changes are the list relationships and joins, which we can utilize in our customizations as well. SharePoint 2010 introduces new capability to have a relationship behavior enforced by a lookup field. Using the lookup field, we can have following options. We can project numerous fields into a child list of the item associated to lookup. We can create joins between the lists. And we can create relational integrity between parent and child list. When relationships are designed, we'll have to consider also security aspect. What if, for example, the user has rights to only child list, but not to a parent list, which is a target of the lookup? These are design considerations which we need to solve one by one. List lookups are used to create relationships between the lists. In this example, we have a lookup associated from the client's list to a project's, and from the project's list to a time card list. This is quite similar as creation relationships using a foreign key in traditional relational databases. Relationships are usually one-to-many typed, like in the slide. But you can also have many-to-many relationships if you associate your lookups from another list to another, and vice versa. When we create relationships between the lists, we can also enforce data integrity. There are two different kinds of options available: trigger cascading delete or restrict delete. Let's have examples of both of the options from the picture on the slide. If we are using the cascade delete and there's a lookups associated between the lists defined in a picture, by deleting client from the client's list, all items in a project list associated to particular client would be deleted. If we would have the same cascade delete relationship from projects to time cards, All time cards associated to those projects which are associated to deleted client would be also automatically deleted. If we have defined the relationship type to be restrict delete, we would not be able to delete any clients which have been associated to existing projects within the project lists, until all projects would be either deleted or associated to alternative client by updating the lookup information. List joins and projections means that when the lookup has been created, we can also project additional fields from the associated list. So when, for example, we create a lookup from the projects to clients, we can define that we are not only interested in the client name, but also some additional fields, which would be also visible in the projects list. These fields would automatically reflect any changes on associated client. Joins are something that the developers can create using object model for their web parts or within their web parts. This way we can get additional projected fields from a list to our query results. Let's cover this option more detailed on the following slide. So, projected fields are basically additional fields from the parent which are referenced and displayed on a child list. When we create a lookup from the UI, we can select secondary fields which are pulled in the child list. These fields are read-only but enable more join-like view. As mentioned in a previous slide, joins are only available for developers using API, CAML or SharePoint Designer 2010. There's a new properties on SP Query to enable this functionality for query functionality. You can also use SP Ling instead of CAML to join two lists in a code easily within few lines of code. This slide shows how the projected fields are visible in the UI. When we create a lookup between the lists, we can define these additional fields to be shown in the child lists. In this case, we select stock ticker to be the only projected field for the lookup. Now when we select the list from the parent list, or select the item for the list, additional fields are pulled to the list view, meaning that in the example we are able to see the stock ticker value of the selected company in list view of the child list. Let's have a more detailed look on these concepts and how we can utilize them within our customizations.
In this demo, we'll concentrate on lists and list relationships. On the site, we have two different lists. We have the projects list, which contains information concerning individual projects, and there's a lookup to employees list. The lookup name is a primary contact, and that has been hooked basically to employees list. And from this list, we can associate the proper persons to be the primary contact for individual projects. At the moment, this is a standard lookup. There's no customizations or additional settings behind, but we can actually create a true relationship between these lists. Obviously, there is already a relationship to the lookup, but we can also do projected fields between the lists, which basically means that since we are associating the primary contact information or the primary contact for the project from the employees list, it's also possible, and we're also possible to add additional fields to be shown within our projects list concerning the particular employee. So if we select the job title and a team as an additional fields to be shown and click OK for the particular lookup and move back to the projects list, we can see that based on the primary contact lookup field, we are also seeing additional fields which are available. And obviously, if I now change the primary contact information of this particular project to something else, we can see that these values are updated automatically. So it's a kind of a join between the fields, or we are protecting the fields from another list based on our settings. What else can we do with what are the different options otherwise? Well, within the lookup, when we create the lookup itself, we can actually define the relational functionality as well, and the actual relationship behavior if we want between the lists. So we can say that there is a restrict delete, for example, available, which will restrict delete of parent items since they have been lookuped to another list. So let's select the restrict delete and let's see how it actually works. So if we go to the projects, we still have the James as James is the primary contact for two different projects. If we go to the employees list and actually try to delete the James, which is the target of the lookup, we will actually get an error because the project list is related to an item on an employees list. And there was a relationship behavior added between these lists. So this way you can kind of create similar relational connections as in relational databases. And the additional option concerning the relational lists was the cascading delete. And if you are familiar with the relational databases, you probably know what this means already. But we can say that cascading delete, so there is an enforced relationship behavior, and let's click OK. And let's have a quick view on our project list. James is now the primary contact of two different projects. If we want, we can create the cascading delete connection or relationship between the lists, and based on that information, when we actually delete James from the employees list, the SharePoint is recognizing that there are items from the projects list also deleted, and making sure that we are aware of this behavior. When we click OK, James is deleted from the employees list, and since we are cascading our delete, the projects which were associated to James list field are also deleted from the projects list. So that's their relational behavior. What about from the project? What about from the object model side? So how do we actually utilize these relationships? Let's move to the Visual Studio side and have a few code examples concerning different behaviors. So we do have two different ways of accessing the list data. We are accessing the list data using COML or accessing the list data using a link, which is the really efficient way in sense of coding accessing the list information. I will start executing this console application, and let's walk through both of these sides. So when we are accessing the list using COML, we are obviously contacting again to the SharePoint site collection from our code. And when we get the contact or when we get the information done, we're able to actually crawl and access the information within that particular site collection. Now we get the execution in, and we can move on to the following steps. So we're accessing that particular site collection, and we are accessing the root web, which is the web which is having the projects and the employees list. And we are getting information or the list distance concerning the projects. And then we are actually interested of getting more information concerning the projects and employees. So we are creating a join between the project list and the employee list. And in this case we are doing that using COML, so we're able to define the join between the items. We are also able to create projected fields for our kind of a view which we are creating on the fly. So we're able to request these additional fields from the employee list, even though they are not part of the SharePoint view. We're able to access those obviously from the object model. And then we can say which of the fields we are actually interested on, as in the view fields. That title is coming actually from the project list, and the primary contact title coming from the employees list, and the job title from the employee list as well. And then we have the query, which is restricting the query only to those where the contact title, primary contact title, basically name of the primary contact, is then jump. We are doing a query against the project list, and we get the results in. The query is executed to the database, and we get at least one item in, and that's it. And if we have a look on the actual result, we can see that we get information of those projects where Dan Jump was associated to, and the title of Dan Jump as well. When we are using the COM query, we actually get the full lookup field value. And the full lookup field value actually has also the index of the item in another list included. In this case, the Dan Jump is a fourth item within the employees list. So that's the reason why it's 4 semicolon and Dan Jump. And this is something kind of a standard COML behavior. So before we could actually render this out, we would be forced to strip this additional non-meaningful information away from the lookup, concerning the lookup itself. On the other hand, if we use the alternative method for accessing or creating the joins between the lists as using ling, we are able to get better information, and the information will be more understandable. So the first thing which we did here, we associated the entity's data context to particular site collection. And this basically is required for our data objects to work against the lists within that particular site. So we have earlier created entities based on using SP Metal, and this entities list or entities code is code-generated code using the SP Metal, and it will have all the dependencies and definitions of the different lists within that particular site, since we didn't use any filters when this was created. And this is kind of a data object layer for the list information. So now we can actually use ling to access the lists and list information. And the key point here is that we're able to do that really complex query, which was done in the COML side and required quite a lot of stuff, using one relatively simple, understandable code. So we are accessing the projects, and we're interested of the project lists, where the project's primary contact title equals Dan Jump, and ordered by project title. And we are interested of the project title, or we created a kind of a dynamic runtime object which will have the project title. It will have the project.primarycontact.title, as in the primary contact title, and the primary contact job title. And the key point here also to notice is that we're able to kind of traverse through this object relationships using the ling. In this case, we're accessing the primary contact list using this really simple notation within our code. Let's move forward and do the actual query. And when we start looping the information, we can actually see that we got the same results as the end result. But since we're using a ling, and these are strongly typed object, the information which we are accessing and what is available is actually completely and immediately reusable without any additional formatting. And that's really good example of the power of ling for coding side. And just to show one more time that the Contoso Intranet Dan Jump CEO, if we move back to the actual internet site or intranet site, we had the Contoso We had the contours of intranet, and the primary contact was Dan Jump, and the contact job title is CEO as well. And the CEO was the value which is actually coming from the job title field from this particular list. So we used projected fields, and we used relationships and joins between these two lists.
So, moving on with different sections. In this section we'll cover the changes for large list support and how to access list information as efficiently as possible despite the amount of items within the list. SharePoint 2010 can support lists with a lot of data, but the larger the dataset gets, the bigger the burden queries put on the server. There are new controls for admins to block the extensive queries. This doesn't, however, help on a view more data once, or it doesn't actually address the so-called 2000 item issue, but instead more or health increases the health and monitoring options for this kind of things. There are two different types of exceptions. Throttled overview that lets a developer with a sufficient permission to write code that requests an override for the 5,000 to 20,000 items, which are the defaults. The default values are configurable in the web application level, and this functions and we can override these per query. In this case, the UI for the list will still function in the same way as it used to, using 5,000 threshold. Site collections and list administrations can request exemptions from the throttle. List view threshold settings is configured from the application settings using central administration application. We can modify following settings. The list view threshold, which basically is the amount of items for the limit. Allow object override enables developers with sufficient permissions to programmatically use threshold for administrators and auditors. This threshold is by default 2000, which is considerably larger than the default threshold 5000. We can also configure the daily window time for expensive queries without a threshold. So if, for example, during nighttime there isn't that many active users, we can configure the expensive queries are acceptable in a specific time. In a list level, you'll see warning on the list setting page if the amount of items exceed the warning threshold. It's important to notice that the warning is based on the total amount of items in a list. This has nothing to do with the query limiting though. You can still have for example, 50 million items in a single list, and the list would work properly if it has been designed properly. Threshold applies for a list views and for the queries applied against the list. Same applies for the custom code, which might have been developed. This means that the warning can be even misleading. But what if I need to iteration through large lists anyway due to some business reason? How do I do this efficiently as possible? And what would be the scenarios to do this? The example scenarios would be something like moving all items tagged with a confidentiality to another repository, meaning in this case a list, or reporting on all items within the site about to go live in the next month, processing all content in a library that is expiring within the next month, and so on. The solution for item handling is the out-of-the-box content iterator functionality. We can and should actually use this model now not only to the large lists, but also for the smaller lists, since this way there's no way of running into these kind of large list issues or throttling issues in the future if the data amounts increase unexpectedly. This is the classical way of accessing the list information. We are querying the items from a list based on some query parameters. In this case, we want to fetch all items with the expiration before June the 1st. In code, we execute the query and would get SP list item collection, iterate through them using for each loop. But since the result set would be 6,000 items, and if the environment has default settings still on, we would never reach the for each loop unless we are farm administrators. So query would not be actually executed, since the result would be over the configured threshold. So how would we actually do this? Let's have a look at a proper approach on the following slide. We are doing the same query as we did in the previous slide, but using the content iterator. In this case, we have defined content iterator page size to be 2000, which would mean that we are actually making 3 calls to the database and get 2000 items in one call. This way we would never hit the threshold and code execution would continue as planned. In a similar way, you can access any other lists as well to avoid issues of accessing too many items at once. And this is exactly the reason why we should use more or less always the content iterators when we are accessing list data. SharePoint 2010 has also introduced some additional constraints that block very large lists to project server. There are constraints concerning the number of the fields that make up a single item in a database. Due to SharePoint's database structure mode, SharePoint row wraps in the database in SQL. SharePoint row wraps the data in SQL when needed. Let's say that you have, for example, 72 number or currency fields in the database. Since each database row has maximum 12 number fields, you are now consuming 6 rows. If you now try to add one more number to your views or to your list, SharePoint would need to row wrap the 7th row. That wouldn't work since the default row limit is 6. If you wouldn't access or add additional number fields and you would be adding, for example, text fields, it would still work. Also, the overall size of the SP list item is limited, and that's a hard constraint in 8 kilobytes. This doesn't, however, mean that there's a limit for attachments as well. This limit only applies information which is stored within the list items, not within the attachments. There's also a threshold for the list view lookups, which is in 2010-8. And that means that exceptions are thrown if code tries to select fields with more than 8 lookups on the query. One of the things you need to be aware of since we have this 8 lookup limit is also the fact that the editor and the creator information within the SharePoint lists are lookups. So this basically means that you're able to create 6 custom lookups for a single view. Let's have a look on the content iterator in practice and how do we actually handle the lead and item queries for the large lists. We'll also be modifying the SP list enable throttling property to demonstrate the different functionalities available.
In this demo, we'll concentrate on a large list handling and a query list view threshold functionalities, which are new in SharePoint 2010. These functionalities are, well, the largest functionality or the large lists handling has been improved, but at the same time we have introduced this list view threshold functionality, which will ensure that if there is not properly written code or not properly created views, the performance hit won't be that, the queries won't be executed and it won't affect the performance, as it actually would if we would query too many items at once. In this case, in our site, we have created a list which has 6,000 items. And there's different values for different items and randomizedly generated. Within this particular list, since we have 6,000 items, we can see actually that we are limiting or over the list view threshold, which is by default 5,000 items. And this doesn't mean that the queries wouldn't perform. This doesn't mean that we are done our information or stored our items in a wrong way. It means that if we access all of the items in a single query, we will get an error stating that we are trying to access too many items at once. So basically, the list item account has nothing to do with the actual list view threshold or this limit or the performance hit. The actual reason or the reasoning behind is that if we are trying to access too many items at once from our query, from our view, then the list view threshold will be applied and our query will be blocked. But if we are accessing the same information in a proper way or using pages and paging and so on, there's no problems whatsoever. So we can actually have hundreds and thousands of items in a single list as long as we're accessing those efficiently. Let's have a demos of this functionality in detail. So let's move on the front page of the site, and we have this quite custom web part. And for the web part I can say which list actually is the large list, and I can show the different functionalities. So I can access the list count, and we have two ways of accessing the list count. Since I'm running the administrator account, and which is a farm account, the list view threshold won't be applied, so I'm able to actually do these queries and able to view the items at once. But if I actually now log into using some alternative account, in this case let's use Dan Jump, which is a editor within this particular site. And Dan Jump does not have administrative farm accounts. So the Dan Jump is a normal end user. And now if Dan Jump tries to access the list account in a kind of a traditional way, accessing the items and items count, we will actually get an error. And the error reason is that we have attempted operation is prohibited because it exceeds the list view threshold enforced by the administrator. So we are unable to actually perform our actions. But on the other hand, if we do our coding and our customizations properly, we can access the list account without any problems if we access the list account or the item account using proper APIs. And for the list account or item account handling, the proper way to access is the following. So if we try to access the amount of items within the list using the list.items.count property, we would actually access all of the items first and then get the count. And this will cause a huge performance hit, and it wouldn't actually work if it's not an administrative user. If the list view threshold, the amount of items is over the list view threshold. The proper way of getting the item count is just use the item account property of the SPay list. And this will work for any single user without no problems. Well, actually, this functionality was already there in 2007, so this is probably nothing new, some of you. If we do the same functionality, or if we access the list item accounts in a traditional way using the queries, we will actually get an error as well if we try to access too many items at once. But if we actually use Content Iterator, which is a new functionality which is available in 2010, we can process these items in a batch or in a pages mode. Currently, within this sample web port, the page mode is 1400. It means that we have 1, 2, 3, 4 batches which are size of 1400, and the last batch will be 400. And how did we actually do this? And I can definitely do this same functionality or using this patch or pages when I'm using a normal account. So this doesn't require any administrative accounts. Let's have a look on the code side. How does it actually work? So if we access the functionality using traditional approach, we usually have some sort of a query string. In this case, we are getting all of the items where the ID is higher than 0, which basically means all. And we do sp query and execute the list.getItems and give the query the string as the parameter for the method. So we're trying to access all of the items using list.getItems. The result would be too high compared to our out-of-the-box settings, so we would actually get an error. And that would nevertheless, even though we would disable the whole functionality, it would have a huge performance hit. The proper way of handling this kind of a large list or generally list item functionality is to use the content iterator. And the content iterator gives us a possibility to define the page size, which the page or the amount of items which we get from the database in a single query. In this case, we have the same query string, we have the same sp query, but we actually use content iterator. And for the content iterator, we can say that the process list items, in this case we are giving the list as a parameter, the query string, and we could define the page size and recursive that it's a recursive query, and then we have two different delegate functions available for process list items and if there's an error. For clarity, I've defined these functions as a separate function, so we're able to actually see the functionalities more easily. So the process list items is getting the 1,400 items at once, and in this case it's actually only writes message which will be written to the UI. But it could actually modify the items in an efficient way as a patched and a paged format. And the error handler is there to handle possible errors if something happens. So using the content iterator, we are able to access a large amount of items in a proper way using this paging. And this is definitely the way we would want every single developer to access lists generally as well, since the overhead of using content iterator compared to using just sp list is totally, well, there isn't any relevant overhead on that. Which basically means that if you use the content iterator to access the list data all the time, you are in a safe side, even though the amount of items in a single list would increase unexpectedly. Let's have a final demo concerning these list throttling functionalities. We are still using the Dan Jump account, which was an editor within this site. If the Dan Jump tries to modify the throttling settings of a single list, we will actually get an error, since Dan Jump is not part of the farm administrator. The list throttling enable disable functionality within the object model is only available when we have farm administrator rights. So if we re-log in using the administration account, we can disable the throttling. I forget to define the list name, so let's have the large list defined as the list name, so we can actually disable the throttling from that particular list. Which means that now if I jump into the site using the Dan Jump account, we can actually do these additional queries as long as I remember to define the list name, large list. We can do these larger queries as well, since the list throttling has been disabled. But this is by far the recommended way of accessing too many items. If we access the content iterator style, we are not causing any performance hit. Now we have only disabled the throttling, but we are actually causing performance problems within the farm. I think we went through quite well the proper way of accessing the items and also the throttling possibilities and what actually happens on the background.
One of the new capabilities or functionalities also in list level is the capability of have validation rules for both field and list item level. In previous version this was only possible for field within field level, but not only it was only possible in field level but not in list item level. We can also define unique column constraints for list columns which we are using within our lists. So the list can now contain columns which require all values in all items within the particular list for that particular column to be unique. This can be configured for the field level, so it applies in the list level, not in folder level. All unique columns must be indexed, which is configured automatically. If you already have existing items in your list and you configure a column to be unique, existing data will be validated. Uniqueness is determined by SQL Server collation, which should be by default configured as case insensitive, accent sensitive, KNA sensitive and wide sensitives. List item validation can be used to determine that the overall item values are consistent compared to the business requirements. In the example shown on the slide, we configure validation rule to ensure that tasks done is lower than the overall task amount. Validation rule is defined using custom formula. We can also define the error message shown if the information is not valid. List item field validation can be used to create validation rules for a particular field. Field validation rule supports also adding user message, which is shown if the information entered is invalid. In the example, we've configured that the age has to be between 0 and 120. If some other values are tried to be entered, updates are declined and the message will be shown for end users. Both validation rules for list item and for list item field can be defined also from code. There's easy to use APIs available to manipulate validation settings based on requirements. Good example of the usage would be to use feature receiver or a feature receiver which is responsible of creating the list first place. This way the list configuration can be fully automated when the feature is activated. Let's have a closer look on the list item and field validations from the UI and also how we could automate their deployment using feature framework.
So, in this demo we'll concentrate on field validation and list item validation functionalities. So we have created a persons list which has currently 3 items or 3 persons listed. And the purpose of this list is to track the people's age and how many tasks they have actually accomplished of the overall task amount which they have been assigned. At the moment we can create a new items in any way we want using any values compared to the actual business logic we have behind the list. So let's add James here and the hometown, and we can define, for example, accidentally that the age is 130 and the tasks accomplished is 30 of the 20, which kind of wouldn't make any sense since James is not that old and you shouldn't be, well, 130 is too old in real life. And we are unable to also do as more tasks than has been assigned to us. So if we try to save it, it will be totally fine and the list item will be created. We can definitely do business logic validation also using the events. But if we use the events, we are showing alternative page for the end user. So fixing the items or fixing particular field can be difficult to accomplish. Let's update the values accordingly and let's actually create the validation rules to our list. So let's move to list settings, and first of all let's define validation rule for age. So age is a number field and we're able to do column validation, which basically means that we're able to create rules which the age has to follow. The age should be less than 120 and the age should be higher than 0. And if it's not, we can define the use message to be shown to end user. Age should be between 120 or 0 and 120. The other thing which we can do with the validations is to define list item validations. So we're able to compare the different field values. And for this, for example, we are able to, for this particular list, we're able to create a rule that the tasks accomplished should be smaller than the actual task amount. And the idea is that we're showing this if the task accomplished, if somebody is saying that he has actually done more than we have assigned tasks, that would be impossible for this particular list. You can't have more tasks done than assigned. Now that we have actually created these business rules for the list, and if we try to enter new items or new people to the list itself, or edit the existing items, these validation rules will be checked. So let's try first the age. And so if we try to update the age to 150, we will actually get a message on the particular, on the exact place where we should actually fix the value. And the item wasn't actually updated. So let's update the value to 15. That was a simple field-based validation. But if we have that field item, list item validation, which was to check that the task accomplished cannot be higher than the task amount, if we try to do something else, we will get a message as well, stating that you cannot have more tasks done than assigned. So we're able to use these business rules or create these business rules also within the list level. So let's actually fix the task accomplished to a valid option. These settings can be also automated as part of your list creation process if you use object model. There's no XML to do this, but we can definitely create the required validation rules using object model itself. And this is relatively simple functionality, or we can do that relatively easily. So the list itself, which is at the moment is the list persons, it has a validation formula, and we can define this formula directly using object model. And we can also define the validation message to be shown to end user if the values don't match. And the other example is to use define the actual age field or validation formula for the age field. So if we now activate this feature, it will create the list if it's not there. If it's there, it will associate these validation rules for particular items in a list level or for the age in a field level. And this way we have created a business logic directly to the list itself, which will be checked as part of the item creation.
In this following section, we'll concentrate on the changes concerning default rendering mechanism for the list information. In SharePoint 2010, there's a new XSLT list view web part available, which is by default used when lists are rendered. Basically, SharePoint has two types of viewing demands: viewing interactive forms for editing the list items and viewing lists of items. For each of these demands, there has been a variety of technologies that have seen the light of the day. SharePoint 2003 introduced basic interaction through the list form and a list view. SharePoint 2007 had the data form web part or data view. All of these technologies are redundant with SharePoint 2010. The new technology is XSLT list view web part. It provides benefits across the board. By making use and building upon rich features of the data view, but making it more generic, SharePoint 2010 has a higher ability for reuse and lowers the bar for custom development. XSLT list view web part provides, for example, better customization support through SharePoint Designer and in-place editing among the other features. The XSLT view web part generally takes the same approach as a normal data view. However, since the XSLT is now schema agnostic, you'll need to pass the schema as a separate parameter and no longer pass the information on content of the view. This provides flexibility on configuration options. Also, since the rendering logic is based on industry standard technologies, it can be more easily adapted by developers. Let's have a closer look on the XSLT list view web part's capabilities and how we can actually customize the rendering logic.
In this demo, we'll concentrate on the XSLT view web part, which is a new rendering technique available in SharePoint 2010, and it provides much more flexible way of changing the UI rendering for the lists and the list items. In this case, we utilize the same list as we did in the previous demos, and we can start modifying this list using the SharePoint Designer. So let's open up the SharePoint Designer to show the capabilities which we have available for the XSLT list view web part. So we're opening up the list or the site within the SharePoint Designer. SharePoint Designer connects to the particular site, and from the SharePoint Designer we can go to the lists and click the person list to view the actual current settings of the particular list. We want to modify the rendering of the all items view, so let's start by editing that. And the all items ASPX file is loaded to the SharePoint Designer, and the functionalities will be visible for editing. And in this case we have the XSLT list view web part available for editing and modification purposes. So there's our XSLT list view, and for this we can do different kind of settings, different kind of functionalities, which are now available to this more flexible way of rendering information. Let's first of all enable the inline editing, so where we can easily add new items without using actual dialog framework for creating the items. The other thing which we want to do is, in this case, there are certain people who are over 20, their age is over 20, and some of the people are younger than 20. So we can actually create these conditional formattings really easily. So let's format the row differently if the age is greater than 20. We start formatting the row, and let's set the row color to something else, so we're able to actually immediately see those rows where the age is different. Now I actually changed the font title or the font color, so let's actually modify that a little bit. So let's change also the background color of the age based on the age information. So if the age is greater than 20, we can set the style for the background, and the background color will be set to something dark, so we can really easily spot those rows where the business rule is matching. Let's save our changes, and now the changes have been committed to the site itself, and we can move to the site and refresh the page. And we can actually see that we are rendering the information differently using the XSLT which we created using the SharePoint Designer. So now that we request the page one more time, we can see that for 2 of these items the background color is dark green and 2 it's not. Well, that's not that readable, but you get the idea. And we also enable the inline editing, which basically means that I'm able to create new items to the list really easily and enable whatever I want. Let's add Dan Brown here as a CEO. Dan Jump, Dan, and it's in New York. Age is 19, and the tax comp list, well, it doesn't matter. Let's do it 20 from the 30, and we're able to save the new item to the list immediately without opening up the dialog framework. So it's kind of up to the designer of the site to decide what kind of ways do we actually enable for editing the items themselves. And this is a really good example of the XSLT functionalities or the improved functionalities which are available since we're using the new web part functionalities or the new web parts.
As a final section to this module, we'll cover the InfoPath support for list forms. We'll shortly also cover the usage of InfoPath forms directly within a web part, which is now completely supported in SharePoint 2010 platform as well. One important platform for authoring the forms is the InfoPath. Earlier versions of the InfoPath did not have high enough level of interaction or integration with SharePoint to allow InfoPath to be the tool to create rich interactive forms. New features in InfoPath 2010 do allow InfoPath to play this role. There are many awesome scenarios that are now available for information worker without the need of involving IT. Simple tasks such as validation of the field, creating regions, or adding images or setting colors can now be easily done inside of the InfoPath productivity UI. InfoPath forms enable end users to create solutions without needing to engage IT organizations, and this definitely provides more flexibility on your SharePoint deployment. One common place to use InfoPath form is to use them to replace the out-of-the-box list view or with other list forms. You can start creating the custom forms directly from the list view itself by clicking available customized form button located in ribbon. This will start up the InfoPath Designer, and after the form is ready and finalized, you can publish the form back to the list from the InfoPath client. Note that the form can also have multiple, on the list can also have multiple different display forms, and you can select which of the forms is the default form for the list. In the example defined in the slide, we customize the InfoPath form by adding a small image and title for the form. This is simply to demonstrate the editing capabilities which we now have in 2010. When we create those InfoPath forms to replace the list view form, additional work has been done by the InfoPath team to ensure that the information workers get their experience they expect when editing forms using the InfoPath. The InfoPath data source is hidden behind the advanced view to hide the hierarchical nature of InfoPath data. The controls that you can use in the InfoPath now also have a parity with SharePoint. This is an example image of an InfoPath directly within a web part. One of the advantages of InfoPath form usage is the fact that InfoPath forms can pull a bunch of related data that you can't do in a regular SharePoint forms. In this case, it's pulling the university address fields from a second list on the same site through a lookup field. And it also has the mapped link as well as getting the tomorrow's weather from the public REST web service. And these are really good examples of the capabilities which we have in InfoPath form rendering technologies. Let's have a closer look on utilizing the InfoPath forms within SharePoint.
In this demo, we'll concentrate on a new, really interesting way of providing the user interface for editing the list items and the full flexibility of designing any kind of form you actually want by using the InfoPath Form Designer. So let's start by creating us a new contacts list, which we use as our list example, and let's name the list as contacts. And when the list has been created, if we try to add a new item, we are using the default SharePoint style of rendering the list items. But if we want, we can definitely design more usable or better user experience for this particular list. For example, to include images and other functionalities, or even third-party data sources, which we can then use to save information. We can start the InfoPath customizations by starting the InfoPath directly from ribbon. And the InfoPath will get started, and it will access the list information or the list data and give us the field view and what kind of fields are available for particular list. Since in this list we are not interested of attachments, I can delete that particular row, and let's also delete this additional messages and additional rows which we don't need for the demonstration purposes. And let's also get rid of those so we're able to collect only interesting information for our business case. Let's resize the field a little bit and our form a little bit, so it will be also nicely visible if we put it on the web part on the front page of the site, which we will also show. Just to kind of have the better feeling of the capabilities, let's also add a image on our form. So we can go to the image tab and click a picture and choose any kind of image which we want to use for this particular list. This image is relatively high or large, but we can resize the image and how it will be rendered based on our requirements. Let's resize the image a little bit. Now the Waikiki Beach looks a little bit funny, but it's totally fine. And let's add some title underneath the image itself. Let's do that as a centralize contacts, and let's recolor that a little bit so it will be evident that it's an actual title of the form. So now that we have actually customized the title, we don't need to save it on the file system. We can directly publish the form to the list where actually the form was opened. There's a quick publish immediately in here, or we can go to the backstage and use the quick publish options, or change any additional settings within the form as well. Let's use the quick publish to show how the form actually is generated, and it will be put back to the site, and now the form template has been published. So if we move back to the site, refresh the page, and start adding new items to the contacts list, we're able to see our newly designed magnificent form, which has the picture of the Waikiki, and we can easily update the values. And using the info path, we can really easily also create this different kind of rules, for example, for particular fields. In this case, we only have rule for the last name, since that's required field for the list. Let's update the values and save the item to the list, and it will be saved in a similar way as we would be using out-of-the-box field. If we want to expose the same form in somewhere else within the site, we can actually do that using the out-of-the-box web port, which is now available for hosting the InfoPath forms. So let's take the front page to edit mode and add a InfoPath form web port to the front page. So InfoPath form web port, let's add that to the front page. And then we need to set what kind of form is visible by default and how it will actually behave as part of the web port properties. So we want to use the form from the contacts list, and the content type is contact, and we want to show the InfoPath ribbon or toolbar, so we're able to actually publish or create other custom submit buttons or even images to our form to submit the information. In this case I didn't do that, so let's leave the InfoPath ribbon or a toolbar to be available. And what do we want to show? We want to show edit item, and let's actually open a new form whenever we submit the information which has been entered. There are multiple other options available as well. Let's click OK, and we're able to see our custom InfoPath designed form directly within the front page of the site. So now if I actually start updating this information, we are able to save directly to the correct list. Before doing that, I want to actually save the changes of the page, just to make sure that we actually have committed the InfoPath form to the page. So let's update or create a new item to the list, and here we go. And from the ribbon we can click save, and a new item will be visible in here, and the item which we just entered will be saved directly automatically to the contacts list based on the information which we obviously entered. Really nice, really flexible, and we can really easily further enhance the different validation rules or have even external data sources within our InfoPath forms. So this definitely provides a flexible way of designing your forms to be able to be used in SharePoint 2010.
So, in this module we covered the key updates and changes in the list structures. We started with the improved support for events, covered the different options of the list relationships, and went through the models to access and manage large lists. After that, we covered the new validation capabilities for list items. As a final section, we concentrated on the user experience elements, mainly on the technologies used for list information rendering in SharePoint 2010, and how we can actually modify or customize the user experience. Thanks for your time, and hopefully this presentation was useful.